Hey YouTube, welcome to part 2 of my RC4 drive 1/24th Trailfinder 2 upgrades videos. In this video I will show you and talk about shocks, suspension, motor and electronics, what's quite a bit. Let's start with the shocks. The shocks of the Trailfinder 2 1/24, those are the stock shocks, are the worst I've ever seen. Not the shocks, but how those are mounted to those ball screws. That's unbelievable. They, at least in my Trailfinder 2, they were mounted super hard. It was hardly possible to move those that way. That's only for the shocks, not for the links, and also not for the steering links, which I did already change. Only the shocks. It was unbelievable. And of course I pressed them with pliers and tried everything. It was super hard to get those at least a little bit loose. What I finally did do, I used my Proxon and screwed or mounted it that way to this Dremel tool, and then not for a bit, for minutes on highest speed, I turned those ball screws and always moved the shocks to get them at least a little bit loose. This was super annoying, probably the most annoying part of all of those mods, and it was unbelievable how firmly those ball cups sit on those ball screws. And now they are, most of them are quite okay, but still not super loose. And still can't believe what I found here. And you see I have two of the shocks here, of the original shocks, the stock shocks, and two still mounted to the truck, but I changed the springs. And in front I don't have the stock shocks. I use those Orlando shocks, which have been recommended. Didn't buy those, I had them here, those Orlando metal shocks. I'm a big Orlando fan and had those upgrades spare here. They are nice, but people recommend to use those, but I don't know how they would use those on the rear end, because here, if you compare a Orlando shock with the original stock shock, you will see that's a little bit shorter, and additionally the Orlando ball screws are a little bit shorter than the RC4 drive ball screws here. So if I would mount, or I did it of course, an Orlando shock here, what I did with the Orlando ball screws, it would not be possible to mount the shock in this angle position. So I could only have mounted it that way, or that way, what looks ugly in my opinion. And that's why I used the stock shocks still. In front position, this was no problem. I could use the Orlando shocks. What's much more helpful than using the Orlando shocks is this kit or set of Orlando upgrade springs for the shocks. You see here, I found this in my mess too for my Orlandos. OLME5-V01 spring set for 1/35 crawler shock, because those springs also do fit perfectly to the RC4 drive stock shocks. The Orlando shocks are not smoother than the stock shocks. So the stock shocks, I put grease into all of those, are at least as smooth as the Orlando shocks. But what's strange, the Orlando shocks are about 1 millimeter shorter, as you can see here, but I wrote it up. They are 27 millimeter, but fully compressed 20 millimeter. And the stock shocks are 28 millimeter, but fully compressed only 23 millimeters. So those have only 5 millimeters, while the smaller Orlandos do have 7 millimeters of travel. That's quite a bummer. Since I used the longer stock shocks on the rear and the little bit shorter Orlando shocks in front, I used the super soft springs of this spring kit with the stock rear shocks. So it even sits a little bit lower now, and I used the hardest springs of the Orlando kit with the Orlando stock shocks in front. And strangely now, come on, not that way. Hey, you're on camera. You have to work now. It seems that it's even a little bit higher in front now. Maybe I could change to medium springs in front. However, it's okay that way. But travel is still horrible. Yeah? So check this out. We have a little bit of travel here, here. But that way there's nearly no way, and it's hard to change this because the axles hit the body. So there is, in my opinion, no way to make this shock way longer. What else to say? I heard some people, they use SX24 shocks. So what would be, for example, those RC4 drive for the 1 to 18th are the same size as the SX24 shocks, or those are SX24 shocks. They are way too big in my opinion. Don't know how, maybe if the body is super high, but that's nothing for me. That's not scale at all. What I again found, the original shocks, the RC4 drive shocks, are ugly, mainly because of this huge screw. This screw has to look outside, at least in the rear position. In front position there is an opening, you can turn it so that it's inside, but on rear position it has to look to the outside, because otherwise it will touch the frame here. And what did I do? I changed those tiny screws against other tiny screws of the same size, but with a much flatter head. So here now there is no touching anymore with those super flat head screws. This works. So the stock shocks work with the ugly screw inside, so you don't see it. Looks a little bit better in my opinion. And the super nice and super soft springs work nicely too. And here's a screw on the magnet, always a pain if you have magnet mounts. So what else to say to the shocks? Not more. Of course, the Orlando shocks are nicer, but you need also the Orlando ball screws. The Orlando ball screws fit. They fit to the metal frame if you thread them in carefully, and they also fit, but they're shorter than the RC4 drive ball screws. They also fit to the front and rear axle. However, the plastic of the axles is super soft, and I played around a little bit, and in some positions, even with the original shocks, threw in the screws, and this plastic is not perfect. So if you wanna buy the Orlando shocks because they look better, it's okay, but I think if you take enough time to spin and squeeze and spin and spin and spin this for minutes, you can also use the original shocks. There will not be a big improvement in performance in my opinion. And if you want to play around with different springs. You can also use those for the stock shocks. Buy this Orlando upgrade spring set if you get it anywhere. The shocks were sitting super firmly, nearly not movable. But the links, however, they are sitting loose, not super loose. They are sitting nicely, so no problem. And I did not change the links. I still use stock links. Don't see really a need for changing those. This Trailfinder 1 to 24th will never be a top crawler, and they are okay and they are light. I didn't change them. What you can see here, I also did not yet change the drive shafts. They are not super sturdy. They are mounted only with a pin and an O-ring. I didn't have problems so far. I didn't drive this truck a lot, but I did already read or hear from someone that the drive shafts broke. So I hope this will not happen. If, then I will have to check. I do have metal drive shafts for Orlando, I guess. But so far it's good. So that's it for shocks and suspensions, I guess. What was not super smooth in my truck and still not easy are the axles. Of course I took the drive shafts off and turned them and even let them run. The front axle runs smoothly, no problem, but the rear axle runs really rough, and I let it run for, I don't know, half an hour in both directions to get them smoother, but still the rear axle is not super smooth. What's also not super easy or could be a problem is mounting of the tires. If you mount the tires, they are a little bit loose. You can mount them more firmly, but if you mount them, that's similar to the SX24. If you mount them too firm, this will be a problem. They will block. So mount them. Now they don't move at all anymore, but I want a little bit of movement so that they can spin freely. If you screw them in too firmly, this will be a problem for the drivetrain. I guess that's everything now about drivetrain, suspension, shocks. And now let's talk about electronics and motor. And now finally to motor and electronics. Of course I did not use stock electronics. I even didn't try. I immediately switched to the FlySky for the Noble GMR micro receiver. I also could have used the micro receiver for the new G7P or any other receiver what you want, and the radio. So I didn't even test anything with stock electronics. And of course I use one of the German top ESCs for brushed micro motors. I run it now on 2S. I tested with 3S and 2S. I did a lot of motor tests. This was quite a bit of an effort, and also I had to buy some motors for testing which did not work. But I think those tiny 260 milliamp hours Turnigy, they fit so perfectly in between here, and they even would stay in place without Velcro because the body keeps it in place. I run those 2S, and my goal was it should be not super slow, and it should have power. And what you see now here is a motor, a 050 motor, RGT motor out of my motor tests, any 050 motor, barrage motor or whatever, on a gearbox of a 050 gear motor. This is my final result now, and you see it can grow really slowly now, and it's absolutely not noisy. So it's not super smooth crawling. I had to choose. I could have used another motor where slow crawl would have been maybe even slower, but then this motor didn't have any power and also not any speed. In my opinion, if those trucks are so super slow, that's boring. And what it does have now, check this out, it does have quite a bit of power. But let's talk about motors, and that's quite a difficult chapter. Here are the stock motors of the RC4-wheel drive Trailfinder 2. That's the N20 gear motor that came with my Trailfinder 2. Super tiny, no power at all, and slow. And that's the upgrade motor that came with my Trailfinder 2. That's an N30, so 20 for 20 millimeters, probably 30 for 30 millimeters. This one is much more powerful, but still not powerful, and it's super fast, and it doesn't have any low speed modulation. It's absolutely horrible. Horrible, horrible, horrible. And even the best brushed micro ESC cannot make a good crawler or truck out of this with this motor. It's really super bad. And of course I tried it with the ASX24 crawler ESC, and also I have somewhere around an even smaller AS612 RW, no chance. And then I tried different gear motors. And let's talk about those gear motors. Those are N30. This is an N20, and this N20 is Orlando size. That's an Orlando gear motor. And those gear motors all do come with the same axle shaft diameter. I guess 3 millimeter is this. But take care, they do not come with the same axle shaft length. So you would not be able to use an Orlando motor in the Trailfinder 2 1/24. And there are cheap motors of this size out on Ali. I didn't buy them for the Trailfinder 2. I bought them already last year, 2 years ago. I tried to use those in Orlando's, and those are super crappy. You see, X never worked. This didn't work either. And they do come with the same size of gearbox in front, and they also do have the longer shafts, but those you see do not have the flat side of the shaft up to the gearbox as the RC4-wheel drive one does. What's not a big deal, you can see it here. I guess this one even worked, or did it? I filed or sanded it with a Dremel tool so I could mount it to the Trailfinder 2, but this was horrible. So forget it, forget those cheap motors. But if you buy those, take care. For the Trailfinder 2 you need this longer shaft, and for the Orlando you need the shorter shaft, but you probably can cut the long shafts to short ones, but not vice versa. What I then did do, and I was recommended to buy those, I even bought those locally, high quality motors from Soul Expert. A slower one, 1/100, and the faster one, 1/50. Those motors, should be quality motors. I was recommended they work fine, but in my opinion they don't work fine at all. I mounted the faster one, I even didn't try the slower one, and they are not super cheap, so this was wasted money for me. To the Trailfinder 2, and even on 3S, I tried 2S, and of course I do also have small 3S Lipos here. This was super slow, much slower than on 2S here now, and additionally it did not have any good low speed modulation. It didn't have any power at low speed. I would have never been able to make this with this motor. So those Soul Experts motors were a big disappointment for me and wasted money, but they were here immediately. I bought them in a local shop here, but not recommended at all. Yeah, of course it's an improvement to the stock RC4-wheel drive motors. It is an improvement, but I never would have really recommended those. If you know how good small crawlers can go, that's not good at all. Not on 3S, not on 2S. So take those away. And I had to think quite a bit, because of course I initially wanted and thought of the larger gear motors, but therefore you have to cut the gearbox. I do only have this gearbox. And how will this work? And this large motor, will the body then fit? And I initially, of course, tried it with a 0.30 sized motor. And then finally, after this one worked fine, I cut the blade, the electronics plate, and mounted the 0.50 sized motor. In my opinion, all those gear motors, I do have, this one is from the HG18 Tiger Dog. I made a video about this. And those motors, this and that one, I bought for my Capo Cup 1. I made several videos about this truck. All those, including the Orlandos, which come with those tiny gear motors, absolutely lack punch. It's probably a result of those gearboxes, no matter if they are that size or that size. And also this one still, it does have punch now. I tried different motors, but that's still nothing against many other crawlers. But that's the best I can get out of this truck, still having good low speed modulation. And I don't know why the companies use those motors for those trucks. Well, probably because if you have pinion and spur gear, the gearboxes are much larger because the gearboxes are smaller. This lacking punch in an Orlando is not a big deal, but in the Capo Cup 1 and mainly in the HG18 with this super tiny and super weak gearbox motor, that's super boring. But no chance, I had to do it that way. And I cut then with a blade super carefully this front part. But before I cut this, of course, I compared the screw mount positions. And check this out now. That's important if you happen or should or want to buy such a motor. Those are the screw holes for the mounting screws with which the motor is mounted to the gearbox. And those gearboxes, as from the stock motor, to have a small distance here. This motor, what is a 0.50 sized, I bought for my Capo Cup 1, one of the test motors, does have a larger distance here. Check this out. Distance to distance. I did not know this before, that I have motors with different sized, different distances here. So you would not be able to mount this motor to the Trailfinder 2 gearbox, but I simply checked and didn't know it. The small 0.30 sized gear motor from the HG18 Tiger Dog and this motor does have the same small distance of the mounting screws as the original motors do have. But those motors use still larger screws. So those are 1.6 millimeter, I guess, and those use 2 millimeter. But this was not, I checked it, not a big problem. Porque, that's Portuguese, because the holes here for the screws, for those countersunk screws, are a little bit larger. So I even didn't have to widen the screw holes here in the gearbox. And I found finally this motor, which I also bought for the Capo Cup 1 but never tried. And this motor, the gearbox of this motor, you see the pinion is missing, does also have a short distance. So I could mount this motor with gearbox, that's that gearbox, to the gearbox of the Trailfinder 2. I know that's super puzzling. I hope anyone can still follow me. So this gearbox I could mount to this gearbox. And I had to use 2 millimeter countersunk screws. And this countersunk, that's that here, That's important because you couldn't use normal screws which have heads which stick out a little bit because they would touch the gears there. So it's important, you need M2 countersunk screws. And this was my biggest problem. I searched all my boxes with tiny screws and finally found two M2 countersunk screws. I would have M3, M2.5, everything but not M2. I found two, one with hex and one with Phillips head, and cut those short, and that way I could mount this gearbox with this motor. However, this motor was super weak. I don't know why. That's a cheap motor. It was weak and it was slow. It was no fun. And then I tried to use a different 050 sized gear motor. I know a buddy in a forum did already do it. You can do this. So that's one of the RGT 050 sized motors. Same results as about the barrage motor of the RGA, the HG18, not the HG18, the Hobby Plus CR18 motors. Quite a nice motor. And I took the pinion, the tiny pinion of this motor off. You can see how those tiny, it's a little bit larger here, and here you can see the tiny pinion. I took it off, what was not a big problem to my surprise, and I mounted it to the 050 motor. But of course there's a problem. The shafts of the 050 motors, even of this Endura, which already does have a short shaft, but of most, that's the Easy RC motor, is much too long. So you have to cut the shaft to a very short position only to mount this tiny pinion gear here. It worked nicely, and this 050 motor now really works nicely. Of course, I would like to test other motors. Come on. Even if I know that most of those have very similar results, I made a motor test video. But the problem is, as soon as I want to test a further motor with this gearbox here in the Trailfinder 2, I have to cut the shaft. And of course, if you cut the shaft to about this length, you can't use the motor for anything else anymore. So I have 4, 5, 6 different types of 050 motors here, but won't test those because I want to use them for the SCX24s, for the CR18s or whatever, the other micro trucks. So that's now my result. I also tried 3S, but it's not necessary. It's really quite nice and good now. With the RGT motor, that's the same as the Barrage motor, the Hobby Plus motor. There are many out there. And that's the way I did it. And that's the way this truck is now. It would be super nice if we could maybe test even more motors, but it's not that easy with this kind of gearbox. Yeah, and that's how it is now. Don't know what else to say. Yeah, electronics, there's such a lot of room if you don't want to use those microelectronics. Here is a lot of room, maybe even for battery. Yeah, and the motor, is it too high? I thought because it's a tiny bit higher than the original gearbox, the stock gearbox, maybe this will be a problem with the interior and I will have to cut it. It even fitted without cutting anything, so maybe there's a little bit of pressure, but it worked even without cutting. However, finally I cut those parts and now it fits perfectly. I know those are quite nice Lipos and they happen to have the exact perfect size, and unfortunately Hobbyking does not have those anymore. That's a shame, but Here would also, I don't see a big problem mounting electronics here. Here's really a lot of room. Maybe you have to make a plate to secure it from the drive shaft. Here you could mount a lot of stuff. Here there's also, for a normal receiver, you should dismantle it probably. Here. However, I highly recommend to cut the original gearbox and to use one of those 050 or 030 sized gear motors. If you buy them, you see it in the pictures on AliExpress. Check out that you choose those with the smaller gearbox and with the smaller distance between screw holes. They are not mounted, but maybe you can see it on pictures. That's the same distance as the gearbox of the Trailfinder 2 has. So that's, what's the distance here? About 10 millimeters distance, screw hole center to screw hole center, and those are about 12 millimeter, and those will fit. Carefully cut this, take care, because here it does already come something of the inner side of the gearbox, but it worked. And of course I was afraid initially to destroy it and then would have to buy a spare gearbox, what would probably have to be bought in the United States. But it worked, it works, and it's good as it is now. What I forgot, of course, initially, I measured the RPM of all those tiny gear motors using my laser measurement tools as for the motor test and with this plate. And I found that the RC4-wheel drive Trailfinder 2 motor, the larger one, is by far the fastest of all. And where is it? It's gone. I did already. Here it is. So, and no low speed, I did already tell. And the others are much slower, but still no low speed modulation. They are not good. I would like RC4-wheel drive would change those motors to one of those kinds of motors which are better, or even to make a normal gearbox, as in most trucks where you have a lot more punch. So that's it for this video, guys, but I know many of you will ask questions. How good does it crawl, and can it compare to an SCX24? Guys, please don't ask this question. An SCX24 is a much larger truck. The Trailfinder 2 is, in my opinion, much more Orlando style or size. Check this out. That's the Trailfinder 2, and that's a pickup, the Chevy SCX24. Check the tires. Check this out. That's a totally different truck, much larger, and of course this with motor, with turbo and axle and different gearbox will crawl much better. And that's a Orlando pickup compared to the Trailfinder 2. So maybe in between those three. That's not 1/24th, and it even will not outperform the 1/24th Hobby Plus CR24s. This one, modded 2S, no way, but even the stock ones on 1S, they have much larger tires, and that way they will be able to crawl, of course, much better. The biggest disadvantage, if you want, for the Trailfinder 2, for its performance, the small tires. Its scale, it looks good now, but if you want a crawler for crawling, buy an SCX24 or FCX24, which again, FCX24, huge size difference. Check this out. 1/24th, different trucks. This one is not the best crawler, and it's super bad performing out of the box. All of those ones are quite nicely performing, or awesome performance out of the box. But now I guess my tiny Trailfinder 2 is quite a nice scale truck with okay performance, and you could use a different motor with this larger gearbox, the motor that came with my gearbox, which is weak, really weak, and you don't have any high speed, but you would have better, so you could even crawl slower than I do now. But of course, all this not with stock electronics, but with the German ESCs. That's it for my Trailfinder 2 1/24. Thanks for watching, guys. Hope to see you in the next video. I'll be back.